The dust hung in the air like a shroud over the small cemetery at the edge of town. Sarah Coulter stood beside the freshly turned earth, her black dress whipping in the hot wind that rolled across the plains. In her arms, her daughter Emma, barely 6 months old, slept peacefully, unaware that her father lay beneath the ground forever. The preacher's words had long since faded, and the small gathering of townspeople had drifted away like tumbleweeds, leaving Sarah alone with her grief and the impossible weight of uncertainty. 3 weeks had passed since the accident. 3 weeks since Thomas had been thrown from that spooked horse and struck his head on a boulder. 3 weeks since Sarah's world had shattered like glass. They'd had dreams, she and Thomas. They were going to build something real on that little piece of land they'd claimed. A home, a future, a life for their daughter. Now those dreams lay buried 6 feet under the Wyoming soil, and Sarah stood at the edge of an abyss she couldn't see the bottom of. The boarding house room she'd taken was costing her the last of their savings. Mrs. Henderson had been kind enough, but kindness didn't pay bills, and Sarah could see the question forming in the older woman's eyes each time they passed in the hallway. How long could a widow with no income stay? The other women in town had been whispering too. She'd heard them at the general store, their voices dropping to hushed tones when she walked past. Poor thing. What will she do? A woman alone with a baby, no skills, no family. Some of them looked at her with pity. Others with something colder, as if widowhood were contagious. Sarah had never felt more alone in her life. Back east, she'd had her parents, her sister, a whole community that had known her since birth. But Thomas had wanted adventure, opportunity, the chance to own land that his family never could have afforded in Philadelphia. So they'd come west 3 years ago, young and in love and foolish enough to believe that love was enough. For a while it had been. Thomas had worked hard, taking jobs on various ranches while they saved every penny. They'd finally scraped together enough to file a claim on a small parcel of land 20 miles from town. It wasn't much. A creek ran through it, and there was decent grazing, but it was theirs. Or it had been. Now Sarah didn't even know if she could hold on to it. A woman couldn't run a ranch alone. Everyone knew that. She walked back toward town as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed too beautiful for such a dark day. Emma stirred against her chest, and Sarah adjusted the sling she'd fashioned to carry her. At least her daughter was healthy and strong. That was something. That was everything, really. But how could she provide for her? She had no trade, no particular skills that would earn money. She could cook and clean, but so could every other woman, and those jobs were scarce and paid almost nothing. She'd thought about trying to find work as a seamstress, but she'd need a sewing machine first, and that required money she didn't have. The thought that had been creeping into her mind for days finally pushed its way to the surface, ugly and desperate. She would have to give Emma up. Some family in town might take her, raise her as their own. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, almost casually, that she knew several couples who would love to have a baby. The words had been kindness wrapped in cruelty, and Sarah had fled from them. But now, walking alone down the dusty street as shadows lengthened, she wondered if that might be the only way. Maybe a child was better off with 2 parents who could feed her than with a mother who loved her, but couldn't provide for her. The thought made her physically ill. She stopped beside the water trough in front of the livery stable and steadied herself against the wooden post. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't. Emma was all she had left of Thomas, all she had left of their love and their dreams. Giving her up would be like dying herself. There had to be another way. There had to be. The sound of a wagon approaching made her look up. The setting sun was in her eyes, and she squinted against the glare. The wagon pulled to a stop beside her, and she recognized John Brennan, the farmer who owned a substantial spread about 5 miles outside of town. She'd met him briefly before, at church perhaps, or maybe at the general store. He was a widower himself. His wife had died in childbirth 2 years ago, along with the baby. He was older than Sarah, probably in his mid-30s, with weathered skin and kind eyes that held their own share of sorrow. He tipped his hat to her. "Mrs. Coulter, I heard about your husband. I'm mighty sorry for your loss." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She was tired of sympathy, tired of the words that couldn't change anything. John seemed to sense her discomfort. He cleared his throat. "I was actually hoping I might run into you. I've been thinking about your situation, and I wanted to speak with you, if you're willing." Sarah felt her defenses rise. Everyone wanted to speak with her these days, and it usually meant they were about to tell her what she should do, as if she were a child who couldn't make her own decisions. But there was something gentle in John Brennan's manner that made her pause. "What about?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. John glanced around the street, then back at her. "Perhaps we could talk somewhere more private. I don't mean any impropriety, Mrs. Coulter. Maybe at the church, or the hotel dining room. I have a proposition that might benefit us both, and I'd like to lay it out properly." Something in Sarah's chest tightened. She knew what propositions meant when men made them to desperate widows. She'd heard the stories, seen it happen to other women. Marriage proposals that were really just offers of indentured servitude. Or worse, suggestions that weren't about marriage at all. She felt herself flush with anger and shame. John must have seen the change in her expression because he quickly added, "It's nothing improper. I give you my word. I'm talking about a business arrangement that might help you keep your land and give your daughter a future. But if you're not comfortable speaking with me, I understand. I know how it looks. I just thought, well, I thought it might be worth discussing." The sincerity in his voice gave Sarah pause. She was in no position to turn down options, even if discussing them felt like admitting defeat. And there was something about John Brennan that seemed honest. Maybe it was the grief she recognized in his eyes, the understanding of loss that came from walking through it himself. "The hotel dining room," she said quietly. "I can meet you there in an hour." John nodded, relief crossing his face. "Thank you, Mrs. Coulter. I'll be waiting." He tipped his hat again and drove the wagon toward the livery stable. Sarah returned to her room at the boarding house and nursed Emma, changed her, settled her in the small cradle Mrs. Henderson had loaned her. The baby drifted off to sleep easily, her tiny hand curled against her cheek. Sarah stood over her for a long moment, memorizing her daughter's face in the lamplight. Whatever happened, whatever she had to do, it would be for Emma. The hotel dining room was nearly empty when Sarah arrived. John Brennan sat at a corner table, his hat on the chair beside him, his hands folded on the tablecloth. He stood when he saw her, waited until she'd seated herself before sitting back down. He ordered coffee for them both without asking, and Sarah was grateful for it. The warmth of the cup between her hands was anchoring. "I'll be direct," John began, his voice low enough that the few other diners couldn't hear. "I've been running my farm alone since my wife passed. It's been hard and lonely, and I'm not managing as well as I should. The house is falling into disrepair. I'm eating poorly because I can't cook worth a damn. The place is starting to look like a bachelor's mess, and that's exactly what it is. I need help, Mrs. Coulter. Practical help." Sarah listened, her fingers tight around the coffee cup. This was leading somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to go. John continued, "At the same time, you're in a difficult position. You need income and security for your daughter. You have land that you can't work alone. Here's what I'm proposing: a marriage of convenience. Practical, not romantic. You would come to my farm as my wife in name, but we'd maintain separate rooms. Separate lives in that regard. You'd help with the house, the cooking, the domestic work that I'm failing at. In exchange, I'd provide for you and your daughter. Food, shelter, security. And I'd help you work your land so you don't lose your claim. We could hire hands to build it up, make it profitable. When Emma is grown, it would be hers, free and clear." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. A marriage of convenience. She'd heard of such arrangements, but had never imagined herself in one. It felt wrong somehow, like a betrayal of Thomas's memory, but it was also the most practical solution anyone had offered her. Still, something about it made her deeply uncomfortable. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "There are other women in town, women without complications. John met her eyes steadily. Because I understand what it's like to lose everything in an instant. Because I see you fighting to keep your dignity and care for your child, and I respect that. And because I'm not looking for love, Mrs. Coulter. I had that once. I'm not trying to replace my wife any more than you're trying to replace your husband. I'm just trying to survive, same as you. I thought maybe we could survive better together than we're managing alone. The honesty in his words struck something deep in Sarah. He wasn't offering romance, or pretending this would be something it wasn't. He was offering a partnership based on mutual need and respect. It was more than most people had given her lately. More than the pity, more than the judgment, more than the whispered suggestions that she give up her child. I need time to think, she said finally. John nodded. Of course. Take what time you need. I'm not going anywhere. And neither is the offer. Sarah left the hotel with her mind spinning. She walked through the dark streets back to the boarding house, checked on Emma, and sat by the window staring out at the star-filled sky. Thomas had loved nights like this. He used to point out constellations to her, tell her stories about the mythological figures they represented. She wondered what he would want her to do now. Would he understand if she married another man, even if it was only on paper? Would he forgive her for choosing survival over remaining faithful to his memory? But it wasn't really about faithfulness, was it? It was about their daughter. Thomas had loved Emma more than anything. He'd held her the day she was born with tears streaming down his face, whispering promises about the life they'd give her. If he could see Sarah now, struggling and desperate, wouldn't he want her to do whatever it took to keep their daughter safe and cared for? Wouldn't he want Emma to grow up on the land they'd claimed together, rather than being given away to strangers? The next morning, Sarah asked Mrs. Henderson to watch Emma for a few hours. She borrowed a horse from the livery stable and rode out to John Brennan's farm. She needed to see it, needed to understand what she'd be agreeing to if she accepted his proposal. The farm was larger than she'd expected, well situated with good soil and access to water. The fields were planted but needed attention. The barn needed repairs. And the house. John had been right about the house. It was a good structure, solid and well built. But it had the unmistakable air of neglect that came when no one cared for it properly. Weeds grew wild in what had once been a garden. The porch sagged slightly on one side. Windows were streaked with dust. John came out when he heard the horse, surprise evident on his face. Mrs. Coulter. I didn't expect you so soon. Sarah dismounted, tying the horse to the porch rail. I needed to see the place. To understand what you're offering. John nodded slowly. Would you like to look inside? The interior of the house confirmed what the exterior had suggested. Dishes were piled in the kitchen. Dust covered every surface. The main room held a cold fireplace filled with ashes that hadn't been cleaned out in days, maybe weeks. But underneath the neglect, Sarah could see the bones of a good home. High ceilings, large windows, solid furniture that had been well made, if not well maintained. There were 2 bedrooms, one that clearly belonged to John, and another that was completely empty, except for some boxes and farming equipment. This was meant to be the nursery. John said quietly, standing in the doorway of the empty room. I built a cradle for it. After my wife died. I couldn't bear to finish it. I put the cradle out in the barn. But it's still there, if you want it. If you and your daughter come here, this room would be yours and hers. I'd move my things to the other side of the house entirely. You'd have privacy. Sarah turned to face him. In the dusty light filtering through the window, she could see the loneliness etched into every line of his face. This man wasn't trying to take advantage of her. He was drowning in his own grief, just as she was drowning in hers. Maybe together, they could keep each other afloat. What about Emma? She asked. You'd be taking on another man's child. That's not a small thing. John was quiet for a moment. I lost my own child before I ever got to know him. Maybe this is a chance to be the father I never got to be. I'm not trying to replace your husband in your daughter's life, Mrs. Coulter. But I could be someone who cares for her, protects her, helps raise her right. That doesn't seem like a burden to me. It seems like a blessing. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them away, angry at herself for being so emotional. But she was tired and scared, and the simple kindness in John's words had cracked something in her carefully maintained composure. "I can't promise to love you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to love anyone else." "I'm not asking you to," John replied gently. "I'm asking you to be my partner, to help me maintain this place and build something sustainable, to let me help you do the same with your land. Love is for young people with their whole lives ahead of them. We're survivors, Mrs. Coulter. We do what we need to do to keep going." Sarah took a deep breath, looking around the neglected room that could be a nursery again. She thought about Emma growing up here, with space to run and play. She thought about her daughter learning to ride horses, helping in the garden, growing up with the dignity of a child who belonged somewhere. She thought about the alternative. The boarding house room getting smaller every day, the money running out, the inevitable moment when she'd have to make choices no mother should have to make. "If I agree," she said slowly, "we do this properly. A real marriage in the legal sense, so Emma is protected. So I'm not just a hired housekeeper you can dismiss when you change your mind, but separate lives otherwise. Separate rooms. A business partnership, nothing more." John extended his hand. "Agreed. We protect each other, work together, and keep our own counsel otherwise. Is that acceptable?" Sarah looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then she reached out and shook it. His grip was firm and collused, the hand of a man who worked hard for what he had. "When?" she asked. "As soon as you're ready. This week, if you like. No point in delaying once a decision is made." 3 days later, Sarah stood in the small church, wearing the same black dress she'd worn to Thomas's funeral. It didn't feel right to wear anything else, and she didn't have money for a new dress anyway. John wore his best clothes, clean but worn. The preacher performed the ceremony with a handful of witnesses: Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper Mr. Davis, and the banker Mr. Collins, who needed to witness the legal documents they'd drawn up. Sarah spoke her vows in a voice that barely trembled, and John spoke his with quiet dignity. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, John didn't try to kiss her. He simply nodded, and Sarah nodded back. It was done. They drove out to the farm in John's wagon, Emma sleeping peacefully between them. Sarah looked back at the town disappearing behind them, and wondered if she'd made the right choice. But then she looked down at her daughter, safe and secure, and knew that whatever happened, she'd done what she had to do. The first weeks were awkward. Sarah threw herself into cleaning the house, creating order from chaos. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, aired out rooms that smelled of loneliness and neglect. She cooked proper meals. Nothing fancy, but hot and filling. John ate like a man who'd forgotten what real food tasted like. He worked from dawn to dusk in the fields, coming in each evening exhausted but determined. They barely spoke beyond the practical necessities. "Dinner's ready. Thank you. I'm going into town tomorrow. Do you need anything?" They moved around each other like careful strangers, respectful but distant. Sarah set up the nursery exactly as she wanted it. John had brought the cradle in from the barn, and it was beautiful. Hand-carved oak with intricate details that showed how much love he'd put into making it. Sarah cleaned it carefully, rubbed oil into the wood until it gleamed, and settled Emma into it. The baby seemed happy in the new space, cooing and reaching for the sunlight that streamed through the window each morning. At night, Sarah lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the farm. Cows lowing in the barn, the wind moving through the fields, John's footsteps in the other part of the house as he moved around before settling in for the night. It was strange and unsettling, but it was also peaceful in a way the boarding house had never been. She had space here, room to breathe, security, even if it came with the constant awareness that she was living in another woman's house, sleeping in what should have been a nursery, existing in a marriage that wasn't really a marriage at all. One evening, about a month after the wedding, Sarah was washing dishes when she heard an unfamiliar sound from outside. She dried her hands and went to the window. John was sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He was crying. Sarah stood frozen, uncertain what to do. She barely knew this man. They'd shared a house for a month. But they hadn't really shared anything that mattered. Still, the sight of his grief struck something in her. She understood that pain too well. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, and crickets were beginning their nightly chorus. Sarah sat down on the steps a few feet from John, not too close but close enough that he'd know she was there. They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, John spoke, his voice rough. Today was her birthday. My wife's. She would have been 32. Sarah nodded, even though he wasn't looking at her. Thomas's birthday is in 2 months. I've been dreading it. Does it get easier? John asked. Everyone says time heals, but I don't feel healed. I feel like I'm just existing, going through the motions. I don't know, Sarah admitted. I hope so. But right now, existing feels like the best I can manage. Some days, even that feels like too much. John finally looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. I'm sorry. This isn't what you signed up for. You married me expecting a business arrangement, not having to deal with a grieving fool falling apart on his own porch. You let me cry in the pantry for an hour last week and didn't say a word about it. Sarah said quietly, I'd say we're even. Something almost like a smile crossed John's face. I heard you. I wasn't sure if I should check on you or give you space. Space was the right choice, Sarah said. Sometimes we just need to fall apart where nobody can see. John nodded. They sat together as the sun finished setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and deep blue. The stars began to emerge, one by one, filling the vast emptiness above them. Sarah had never felt more aware of how small she was, how insignificant her grief was in the face of an indifferent universe. But she also felt less alone than she had in weeks. There was something comforting about sitting beside someone who understood pain without needing to explain it. The seasons shifted. Summer heat gave way to autumn cool. Sarah and John fell into a rhythm that, while not quite comfortable, was at least predictable. They worked together to bring in the harvest, Sarah cooking enormous meals for the hired hands while John oversaw the work in the fields. The farm was profitable, more so than Sarah had expected. John was a good manager despite his grief, and the land was generous when properly tended. True to his word, John helped Sarah with her own land claim. They hired men to build a small cabin on the property, to work the soil, to prepare it for future development. Sarah went out there once a week to check on the progress. Sometimes John came with her, offering advice or labor. He never tried to take over, never suggested the land should be his instead of hers. He respected the agreement they'd made, and Sarah was grateful for that. Emma was thriving. At 9 months old, she was a happy, healthy baby who had started pulling herself up on furniture and babbling constantly. John was surprisingly good with her. He'd carved her wooden toys in the evenings, sitting by the fire with his knife and a piece of wood, creating small animals in simple shapes. Emma loved them, clutching them in her tiny fists and waving them around triumphantly. Sarah watched him with her daughter and felt something complicated stir in her chest. It wasn't love. She wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that. But it was appreciation, maybe even the beginnings of affection. John had kept his promises. He'd provided for them, protected them, treated Emma like she mattered. That was worth something. That was worth a lot, actually. Winter came hard that year. Snow piled high around the farmhouse, and there were days when they couldn't leave even if they wanted to. Sarah and John were forced into closer proximity, sharing the main room where the fire kept them warm, while the rest of the house grew cold. They began to talk more, at first about practical things, then gradually about deeper matters. John told her about his wife, about how they'd met at a church social, about her laughter and her love of music. Sarah told him about Thomas, about his dreams of building something permanent, about the way he'd danced with her in the moonlight, the night Emma was conceived. They shared their grief like people sharing bread, breaking it into pieces small enough to swallow without choking. One particularly brutal evening, when the wind howled like a living thing and snow piled against the windows, Emma caught a fever. Sarah had been through minor illnesses with her before, but this was different. The baby burned hot to the touch, crying inconsolably, refusing to nurse. Sarah tried everything she knew: cool cloths, lukewarm baths, small sips of water, but nothing helped. John watched from the doorway as Sarah paced the room, bouncing Emma and trying to soothe her. "Should I try to get the doctor?" he asked, though they both knew it was impossible. The snow was too deep, the roads impassable. They were on their own. "I don't know what to do," Sarah said, and there was panic in her voice. "What if she gets worse?" "What if?" "She won't," John said firmly. He came into the room and gently touched Emma's forehead. "She's strong, like her mother. We'll watch her through the night. Take turns so we're both not exhausted. If she gets worse, if her breathing changes or the fever spikes higher, we'll reassess. But I think she just needs time and care, and she has plenty of both." They stayed up all night together. John boiled water for steam to help Emma breathe easier. Sarah held her daughter and sang every song she could remember, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. When Sarah's arms grew too tired to hold Emma any longer, John took over, walking slow circles around the room, while Sarah collapsed in a chair and dozed fitfully. By morning, the fever had broken. Emma woke up fussy but clearly better, and she nursed hungrily while Sarah cried with relief. John made coffee and breakfast, his own eyes red from lack of sleep but his expression calm. When Emma finally fell into a peaceful sleep, Sarah laid her gently in the cradle and turned to find John watching her with something indefinable in his eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I couldn't have gotten through that alone." "You're not alone," John replied. "Not anymore. We're in this together, remember?" Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of how different this felt from the transaction they'd agreed to months ago. Somewhere along the way, without either of them quite noticing, they'd become something more than business partners. Not husband and wife in the traditional sense, but not strangers either. They were allies, perhaps even friends, bound together by necessity and growing respect. Spring came, and with it new life. The fields turned green, and the farm exploded with activity. Sarah planted a garden, determined to make the place beautiful as well as functional. She put in vegetables and herbs, but also flowers, roses and daisies and sunflowers that would make the farmhouse look like a home instead of just a place to work. John noticed. "That's pretty," he said one evening, looking at the neat rows of seedlings she'd planted. "Ruth wanted a flower garden. I never got around to building it for her." Sarah paused in her work, unsure how to respond. "I can plant something in her memory, if you'd like, somewhere special." John considered this. She loved violets. "There's a spot behind the house, near where the grass meets the woods. She used to sit there in the evenings and watch the sunset. Could you plant violets there?" "Of course," Sarah said softly. They went to town the following week, and Sarah bought violet seeds. She and John planted them together in the spot he'd described, working side by side in comfortable silence. When they finished, John stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "Thank you," he said, "for honoring her, for understanding that even though we're married, she still matters. Thomas still matters to me." Sarah replied, "I understand." Something shifted between them in that moment. A door opening that neither of them had realized was closed. They looked at each other across the freshly planted earth, and Sarah saw John not as the man who'd saved her from destitution, but as a person, complex and scarred and trying his best to survive his own losses while helping her survive hers. That evening, after Emma was asleep and the dishes were done, Sarah found John sitting on the porch as he often did. She brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, closer than she usually did. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about this arrangement we made." John tensed. "If you're unhappy, if you want to leave." "That's not what I mean," Sarah interrupted. "I'm not unhappy. That's the thing. I thought I would be. I thought this would feel like a cage, like I'd given up my freedom to survive. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Like we're building something real. Not what we lost, not replacements for Thomas or Ruth, but something new that's ours." John was quiet for a long moment. "I've felt that too," he admitted. At first, I thought having you here would just be practical. Someone to cook and clean, to help with the work. But it's become more than that. You've made this house feel like a home again. And Emma. His voice caught. Having a child's laughter in this house has healed something in me I didn't know needed healing. Sarah reached over, and for the first time since they'd married, touched his hand deliberately, not accidentally. I'm not saying I'm ready for everything that a real marriage entails. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready. But I'm saying that maybe we don't have to be quite so separate. Maybe we can be partners in a fuller sense. Friends. Family. John turned his hand over and gently squeezed hers. I'd like that. Whatever you're comfortable with, whatever pace you need. There's no rush. We have time. They sat together holding hands as the stars came out, and for the first time since Thomas died, Sarah felt something other than grief or fear or desperation. She felt hope. Small and fragile and tentative, but real. Hope that maybe she could build a new life without betraying the old one. Hope that Emma would grow up happy and secure. Hope that she and John might, in time, find something together that neither of them was looking for, but both of them needed. The years passed. Emma grew from a baby into a toddler, then a little girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. She called John, Papa, without prompting, and he melted every time she did. Sarah and John worked the farm together, expanded it, made it successful. They worked Sarah's land too, building it into a viable ranch that would one day belong to Emma. They moved slowly toward each other, careful not to push, not to demand more than the other could give. 1 year after that conversation on the porch, they stopped keeping separate rooms. 2 years after that, Sarah found herself pregnant with John's child. She cried when she realized it, not from sadness, but from the complicated joy of knowing she could love again, could build a new future without erasing the past. Their son was born in the autumn, healthy and strong, with John's steady temperament and Sarah's determination. They named him Thomas John, honoring both the past and the present. Emma was delighted to have a baby brother, taking her role as big sister very seriously. Sarah stood in the doorway of the farmhouse one summer evening, 5 years after she'd first married John, and looked out at the life they'd built. Emma was chasing chickens in the yard, shrieking with laughter. John was walking in from the fields. Thomas John perched on his shoulders, both of them dusty and tired but content. The garden was in full bloom, roses climbing the porch rails, vegetables heavy on their vines. In the distance, she could see her own land, no longer just a claim, but a working ranch with cattle grazing peacefully. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd married Thomas all those years ago. It wasn't the dream they'd built together. But it was real and solid and good. She'd learned that grief doesn't end. It just makes space for other things. You carry your losses with you always, but they don't have to be all you carry. John reached the porch and lowered Thomas John to the ground. The little boy immediately ran to Sarah, throwing his arms around her legs. Emma followed, demanding dinner and attention in equal measure. John climbed the steps and stood beside Sarah, and she leaned into him without thinking, a gesture that had become natural over time. "Good day," she asked. "Good enough," he replied. "Better, now that I'm home." Sarah smiled. Home. That's what this place had become. Not just a refuge or a compromise or a business arrangement, but home. They'd built it together from necessity and grief, from practical choices and gradual healing. They'd built it with patience and respect and, eventually, with love. Not the passionate, consuming love of first marriages, but something quieter and deeper. The love of two people who'd survived storms and chosen to face the next ones together. As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in those familiar shades of orange and red, Sarah held her family close and felt gratitude wash over her. She thought of the woman she'd been, standing alone in that cemetery with a baby in her arms, and no idea how she'd survive. She thought of John's words in that hotel dining room, offering partnership when she'd expected pity or exploitation. No one had wanted a helpless widow. But John had seen past that, had seen her strength and her determination, had offered her a chance to be something more than her grief. and she'd taken it, terrified and uncertain, and discovered that sometimes survival is just the beginning. Sometimes, when you're brave enough to accept help and patient enough to heal, survival transforms into something much better. Something like hope. Something like happiness. Something like home.